Hello, boys and girls. This is Mrs. Phillips, and I am going to be reading to you one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors called The BFG by Roald Dahl. We'll be reading a couple of chapters together each day, and by the end of the 2 weeks, we should be finished. And hopefully, when we get to return back to Crieve Hall, you guys can take an AR test on this book. So listen very carefully as we read together, and I hope that you enjoy this funny and sweet story together. We'll start with chapter 1, The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was a shining night onto her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voice came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such silence. Perhaps she told herself this was what they called the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in their deep, deep sleep. And all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtain. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out, even if you said you had to go to the laboratory. That was not acceptable or an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on, and then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again, and everywhere it was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong that she couldn't resist. Quickly she ducked under the curtain and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well, seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in fairy tales. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't even look real. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eyes to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly, she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black. It was something dark. It was something very tall and very black and very thin. It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than the upstairs windows on the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, and then it would move on. and then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Ah, Sophie could see what it was up to now. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the windows upstairs of each house on the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in, and then it would slide on to the next house and stop again and peer in, and so on all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps? Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that really was what it was wearing a long black cloak. And in one hand he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucci's house. The Gucci's had a greengrocer's shop on the middle of High Street, and the family lived above the shop. The two Gucci children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it, and it looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screwed-on top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of the long trumpet. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the open staircase upstairs in the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath, and woof, he blew through the trumpet. There's a little picture. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under her blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse and tingling all over. Chapter 3, The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or two, she lifted the corner of her blanket and peeped out. And for the second time that night, her blood froze to ice, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in across the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm and the hand and the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by her bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping a hold of her, and then she was lifted up from the bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. Now, if you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, let's hear about that. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that the monster, or the giant with the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from her own bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that all he could grasp were the four corners of it once in his huge hand, and Sophie was imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and he ran off. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast that his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply just strode over them. A wide river appeared in the path, and he crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's legs like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a long while, a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he is hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible. And he's going to have me for breakfast. The cave. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in the way that he was running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a high speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheek. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. It had a weird sensation that they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were on land or on the sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down on the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all at once the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forest and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use. He was rattling through a great forest, and he leapt over dozens of rivers and down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie still peered out of the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying like delicate frosty white flakes of clouds. And over to the side of the rim, the morning sun was coming up, bright as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily, and his great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in another. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hid from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave, and all was pitch black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground, and then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He's getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or maybe he will have me fried. He'll drop me into a rasher of bacon with some gigantic frying size, sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place, and Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cave with high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there were rows upon rows of jars. Jars and jars were everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. And in the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black coat and hung it on the wall, and Sophie saw that under that cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather coat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie crouched on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazing back at him through his steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has we got us here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with her hand and carried her across the cave and put her on a table. "Now he is really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from the head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like a huge slice of white bread. Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you's thinking I's a man-gobbling cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful. And they does gobble up human beings. We is in the giant country now. Giants is everywhere around us. Out there's the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noises ear-bursting, noises crunching bones going crackety-crack for miles around." "Oh," said Sophie. "Bone-crunching giant is gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night bone crunchers galloping off to Turkey to gobble up the Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why, Turks?" she blurted out. "What is wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so juicier and scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamoury flavour. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "Oh, I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly indifferent. Some is scrumptiddlyumptious and some is ucky slush. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is ever eating Greeks, ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Well, Greeks from Greece is tasting all greasy," the giant said. I imagine that is possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of trembling what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your brains is emptier than a bone dongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation toward a light, slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We's having us an interesting babblement about the taste of human beans. The human beans is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human bean, the giant said. The human bean has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue any more. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant angry. The human bean, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting of whooshary fish. There is something very fishy about Wales. You mean Wales? Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys? Sophie said. You are once again gobble-funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, Giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thighs. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste like? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant said triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste, so says the welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste like? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, said Sophie. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than just be kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me, said the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars shadow on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I's a freaky giant. I's a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. So we're going to end our reading today. There's a little picture of the giant talking to Sophie on the tall table. And if you're wondering why my voice changes a little bit, it's because this setting of this story is in England. So I'm trying to adopt an English accent. Also, I love the way that this book is full of great figurative language, lots of similes and metaphors and things we can talk about a little bit later. If you'd like a fun art activity today, I think it'd be really cool if you wanted to. If you could draw what you think the BFG looks like based on my description of him in the prior chapter. I'm going to go back and kind of describe him to you, so maybe you can sketch him and draw him on a piece of paper. Remember, it said he had a long black coat and he was super tall and super skinny. And under the cloak, he was wearing a collarless shirt and dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons, so long coat without any buttons. His trousers were faded green, and trousers are a fancy word for pants, and they were too short for his legs. Also, on his bare feet, he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. So maybe you could draw a picture with his toes sticking out of his shoes. And remember, he had really giant ears. So I'm glad you were with me today reading, and we'll pick back up tomorrow. Each day we'll read for about 20 to 30 minutes and enjoy some of this great book. And now you know why it's called the BFG, because it stands for the Big Friendly Giant. Hope you guys are having a safe, healthy day today, and I look forward to reading more with you tomorrow.